Whether or not a recession is actually imminent, I think what really matters for travel is what consumers think will happen. So whether or not a recession happens, if people are bracing for it, then that affects the way that they potentially spend, especially in these large spend categories like travel. So that's something we're definitely looking at. Definitely in the US, summer was a high season for travel as it normally is. People were willing to splash out a little bit more, but we're seeing a little bit of that belt tightening coming into the next year. And, certainly we're seeing the same in Europe, where inflation has really eaten away at a lot of consumer savings. There are some high points in Asia, as Monica was talking about, but those can be a little bit deceiving too, because the big growth that we've seen in China and Japan is mostly because last year at this time there weren't a lot of opportunities for international travel out of those markets. So there's a lot of growth, but it doesn't necessarily mean we're back to where we were before the pandemic.
Hi, Lindsey. Monica here. And I know you've been following this for years because I've been reading all the reports coming out of Morning Consult. But the thing that gets me about this report is that we're seeing the falling interest coming out of Europe. Now, we saw Europe and the U.S. really starting to set the trends because they opened early and travel really started there. So if we're starting to see some cracks in travel enthusiasm coming out of Europe, what does that say that could be in the future for other regions?
It is really concerning. And one of the things that I've been kind of looking at in terms of the summer travel is that a lot of Americans, when they took trips this summer, went to Europe. And that really pushed the prices higher for Europeans as well who were traveling within Europe. So that might be one of the things that's contributing to that concern, is the fact that they're being really faced with the higher prices in their own home markets and in the markets nearby where they may be usually traveling to in the summer. So I think that's something that we should be looking at, is what is the impact of outbound travel and the growth in some of these markets and how that's going to impact, travelers domestically as well. So it's certainly something to be concerned about. I mean, what we're seeing overall, despite the variations in some markets, which I do think is promising, is that in a lot of places there has been kind of an evening year over year. We're seeing similar folks, similar numbers of people this year say that they're going to take a trip that as they did last year at the same time. So while that does show us that maybe some of that revenge travel is slowing down, it also suggests that people have settled into new patterns, and that what's happened in 2023 may be a really good sign and a good benchmark for what's to come.
Yeah, so that's the interesting thing. Even if we see revenge travel fall off a bit, this, this notion of this new normal, that people now view travel as something that's important to their mental health. How do we reconcile those two things? That the new normal is for high levels of travel, but if revenge travel falls off a lot, where do you see us coming maybe in about a year? Where are we? Are we slightly lower than we were coming off of 2023, or really just quite the same as that?
I think we'll probably be at similar levels to where we were in 2023. I think we've really seen revenge travel kind of taper off throughout the year, and where we saw it really surge was sort of beginning of summer. And revenge travel is very much people who were waiting to travel until this period of time. They had saved up money. They had waited until they felt comfortable with the kind of post-pandemic restrictions lifting and feeling more comfortable about the health implications of traveling. And they've really settled into these kind of new patterns. We've actually done a lot of work in trying to understand what is a better benchmark going forward. Is it that kind of past year behaviors, or is it what people used to do before the pandemic? And over again, we're seeing that the past year behaviors are more predictive of the future. So I think what we're going to see in 2024 is going to look very similar to 2023. Now, where people are going might change a little bit. Obviously, we saw, a surge of American travelers going to Europe. That may, taper out to different areas and not be so strong in Europe next summer. But I think the volume kind of overall in general will probably remain pretty similar next year as to what it was this year.
Okay, so if we are coming to the end of seeing this sort of travel at any cost, at any rate, don't care, I'm going on this trip no matter what, could that mean that we could start to see some relief in terms of airfares and hotel prices if demand does slightly fall?
I hope so. We're already seeing some in the States, actually. I'm seeing especially some of the lower cost carriers do some serious discounting into the fall, which suggests to me that, the demand isn't quite as high going into the shoulder season. So I do believe travelers are going to be able to find more deals going forward. And that's one of the things that we've been tracking as well is, how far in advance people are actually booking their travel. And we're starting to see that they are booking further and further in advance as they are less less concerned about potentially having to shift their travel plans because of some sort of COVID surge or change in regulations, and more likely to to book further in advance of their travel so they can make sure that they're finding the best deals. So people are certainly deal centric, and we're starting to see some of that actually come to fruition as well, which is great news.
Lindsey, got to ask you, we've been following the story of an executive from Kroll who was allowed into China. That was not a problem. The problem is they're not letting him leave. And this is sort of not an isolated situation. It's becoming more and more dangerous for Westerners, including Americans, to go to China. Is that showing up in any of the travel numbers at all, or?
You know, one of the things that we're definitely seeing in terms of travel between the U.S. and China is that geopolitical tensions have an impact on the way people think about travel. That's just one aspect of it. We are also seeing that the lack of flights between the two markets are also impacting people's willingness to travel. But, you know, those numbers are very muted compared to where they were before the pandemic because there aren't as many flights to go. And also there, you know, while I don't think that travelers think about geopolitical tensions and concerns about, you know, safety in terms of like that at top of mind when they're planning their travel. News coverage of incidents like that does stick in people's minds when they're thinking about where to go. So that's certainly something that we need to continue keeping an eye on.